And the entire Jewish nation fumbled the tradition. It was lost. And no one in your family has known anything about Mount Sinai until now, when I, Fred, came back to tell you about the Sinai event.
For centuries, Jewish apologists have argued that the national revelation at Mount Sinai could not be false. In this video, we will respond to one form of such argumentation presented by Rabbi Kelemen. Let's begin.
The Book of Exodus, where there you see a story about how 3 million people escape Egypt, they make it to Mount Sinai, and there God appears and he speaks to 3 million people. Now that is impressive. 3 million people, what are the odds that 3 million people would have all conspired, told a lie about a mass revelation, and no one in that entire generation would have confessed and said, we made it all up? What are the odds? An Orthodox Jew will tell you.
The claim of 3 million eyewitnesses at Sinai is a liability, not an asset, for Rabbi Kelemen's argument. Population estimates based on archaeological data for Egypt and Canaan, as well as some statements in the Bible, indicate that this number is most likely an example of the ancient Near Eastern practice of exaggeration. Now, if this detail is historically inaccurate, how many more details suffer from the same problem? In the long run, this argument doesn't help Judaism's credibility, it actually hurts it.
And if you try this in a university classroom, they will laugh you out of the room. They will ask the most obvious question on the planet. Tell me something. How do you know that God spoke to 3 million people? Well, it says so in the Torah. Well, who wrote the Torah? According to the latest technology, what they're teaching today in most universities across the planet, the Torah is written by 4 men, J, E, P, and D. What happened was the redactor, or some friend of the redactor, passed this book off on some unsuspecting group of cult followers, told them, look, God spoke to all of you, all of your ancestors, God spoke to you, and here's the story, 3 million people heard God speak. And at that point, the credibility of Judaism is reduced to absolutely zero. We are just like every other religion on the planet. One person told a story. He made up a story that there was once a charismatic leader by the name of Moses, and once upon a time, the Jews arrived at Mount Sinai. And there they all accepted the Torah and the whole thing was up and running. But then it was lost. And for generations, no one knew about it. Until this charismatic cult leader, who actually made up the cult in the first place, quote unquote, relaunched the religion. It's a very powerful theory. And there's one small problem with it. And that's this. I ran an experiment several years ago. I went to a great sage in Jerusalem and I asked him, the Torah that you're teaching all these thousands of people, where did you get it? He said, I got it from my teacher. What was his name? Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz of Mir. I checked. I found 4 independent literary sources confirming a teacher-student relationship. I got birth dates and death dates. I went back to him. Your teacher's teacher, who was that? Where did Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz get this whole story? And he said he got it from his teacher, Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv of Kelm. I checked. 4 independent sources, birth dates, death dates. After 2.5 years, I had assembled 4 independent literary sources for every post-biblical name in the chain. I established a chain of tradition that goes from me back to Moses at Mount Sinai.
The reason why Rabbi Kelemen could not establish a student-teacher relationship for those names from the biblical period is because we don't have any evidence that they were teachers and students of each other. The earliest document which establishes a chain of tradition is the Mishnah, in which it simply generalizes the transmission from prophets, without properly explaining the details. There is also the famous controversy of the missing 168 years of rabbinic history from the Persian period, which would suggest some sort of gap.
Now, I'm not telling you anything on that sheet is true. I'm telling you something far more powerful. I have all those books on my shelves. And what I'm telling you is, that chain is what Jews believe. That's what they claim. What's the problem? They're claiming that there is a continuous, unbroken chain from today going straight back to Sinai. Why is that problematic? Go back to past theory. In past theory, charismatic cult leader comes to you and says, there was Moses, there was a gap, and there was Fred, MGF. If I persuade all of you, Moses, gap, Fred, MGF, what do you tell your kids? MGF. What do they tell their kids? MGF. And you have generation after generation talking about Moses, then a gap, and then Fred. And yet, when we start looking at Jewish communities and their histories, we find no record ever of a significant gap in Jewish history, a period where people couldn't ask their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents and hear about the word Sinai. It's a continuous line. Where is the gap in Jewish history?
We also have numerous biblical texts and commentaries of rabbis that demonstrate the biblical Jews didn't really care to transmit properly the traditions, and in fact, constantly violated it, and even lost the Torah.
And even worse, where's Fred? I spoke at Yale a few weeks ago. I asked a group of students there with degrees, advanced degrees, Jewish studies. I asked them, tell me something. What was the name of the man who went up on the mountain, got the Torah, and brought it down? So a few of them called out, that's easy, Moses. I said, okay, you might earn a PhD. Right now you're up to a BA. Let me ask you a tougher question. When the Jews were abandoned by Moses, Moses died, and the Jews had to go into the land of Israel, who took them in? And a bunch of people confidently said, that was Joshua. I said, I see you know Jewish history. Let me ask you a tougher question. The Jews were in Babylon, and there they were redeemed, and they came back to the land of Israel. Who was the great leader who brought the Jews back to the land of Israel? And a bunch of people cried out, that was Ezra. We all know that was Ezra. Who redacted the Mishnah? Someone cried out, Judah the Prince, Yehuda Nasi. Who redacted the Talmud? Ravina and Ravashi. I asked them, how do you know all these names? The answer, these are the most famous people in all of Jewish history. We know of their accomplishments. They're written up in every Jewish book. Then I turned to 4 biblical critics who were standing on the dais with me, and I asked them, gentlemen, can you please tell me, who is Fred? And one man confidently stood up and he said, Fred is Chizkiyahu. And the fellow standing next to him said, it can't be Chizkiyahu, it's Yirmiyahu. This guy says, it can't be Yirmiyahu, it's Ezra. This guy says, it can't be Ezra. And you just stand back and they kill each other. Now, why are they arguing? Don't they know? And the answer is because in 24 books of the Bible, in 60 volumes of the Talmud, in dozens of volumes of Medrash, there is not a single word about the greatest crisis ever in Jewish history, a crisis where for generations the Jews knew nothing about Sinai.
Rabbi Kelemen is inaccurate again. There hasn't been much argument over the big picture on who Fred was. Most biblical scholars would point to 2 Kings 22 and Nehemiah 8 for evidence of at least 2 redactions of the Torah. In 2 Kings, Hilkiah the high priest is responsible for finding what would later become Deuteronomy. In Nehemiah, Ezra the scribe seems to have added more material to the P source in Leviticus. Regarding Rabbi Kelemen's own experience with debates at Yale over who is responsible for the redactions, there is some truth to the fact that we don't have clear-cut knowledge of who edited every element of the Torah, but with regards to Hilkiah and Ezra, mainstream scholarship has more or less agreed.
Every single person in this room believes natural things happen more than once. That's the backbone of scientific theory, and there's a good reason for believing that. If it is normal and natural to be able to launch a mythology about mass revelation, it should happen again. And yet, in 5,000 years of comprehensive religious histories, we do not have a single nation, a single group of people, 500 people, 250 people, 100 people, who all claim they heard God speak and lived to talk about it. There's no such thing in human history. It doesn't exist. Whatever rational explanation you'll give me, the more probable you make your explanation, the more you say that could easily happen, then the more powerful my question becomes. If it could easily happen, why didn't it ever happen again?
While history doesn't repeat itself, it often does rhyme. The Mormons believe that God spoke simultaneously to a group of people.
It came to pass that there was a voice heard among all the inhabitants of the earth upon all the face of this land. Woe, woe, woe unto this people. Woe unto the inhabitants of the whole earth, except they shall repent. For the devil laugheth, and his angels rejoice because of the slain of the fair sons and daughters of my people. And it is because of the iniquity and abominations that they are fallen.
A few moments later.
It came to pass that while they were thus conversing one with another, they heard a voice as if it came out of heaven, and they cast their eyes round about, for they understood not the voice which they heard. And then he goes on to describe the voice, not being harsh, neither was it a loud voice, and it was a small voice, but it did pierce them that did hear to the very center, and it caused their whole souls to quake and their hearts to burn. It came to pass that again they heard the voice, and they understood it not. And again the third time they did hear the voice, and did open their ears to hear it, and their eyes were towards the sound thereof. Behold, the third time they did understand the voice which they heard. Behold, my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, in whom I have glorified my name. Hear ye him. Look up and they see a man descending from the heavens, dressed in a white robe, it says. And he came down and stood in the midst of them, stretches out his hand and says, Behold, I am Jesus Christ, whom the prophets testified shall come into the world.
And even Rabbi Kelemen has told us of a story from India where a mass revelation happened as well.
He said, Mr. Kelemen, at the Battle of the Bhagavad Gita, how many people were present? 3 million. He says, yes, Mr. Kelemen, and we have an oral tradition that at the Battle of the Bhagavad Gita, our chief god, Krishna, descended in the sight of all 3 million people. He spoke to them and all 3 million people dropped dead, just like your people at Sinai.
And just like the Jewish mythology, these counterexamples also have a gap and fret of their own in order to launch the story. The Book of Mormon was lost, and later found by Joseph Smith. Same is with the oral Indian tradition.
I said to him, let's go over this again. God spoke to them, they all dropped dead, what happened next? He said, well, they laid there. I said, well, they didn't get back up again? He says, no. So I said, they were all dead? He said, yeah. So I said, then how do you know the story? So he says, well, many, many years later, that God came to one guy, told him, and then he told everybody else.
The kippah fits, why don't you just wear it?